April 21, 1945. A quiet forest clearing between Duburg and Lintow, Germany. Field Marshal Walter Model stood alone among the trees, his service pistol heavy in his hand. Behind him lay the shattered remains of Army Group B, over 300,000 men who had surrendered to American forces in the previous days. Before him stretched a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. He could not surrender without betraying his oath, nor could he face Soviet captivity. The gunshot that echoed through those woods that afternoon marked more than the end of one man's life. It marked the collapse of an entire belief system that would puzzle historians for generations. Between March and May of 1945, nearly 3 million German soldiers surrendered to American and Western Allied forces. Many walked miles through their own defenses to reach U.S. lines, tossing away weapons, waving makeshift white flags crafted from bedsheets or tablecloths. They didn't surrender because their armies were crushed or their ammunition was gone. They surrendered deliberately, even desperately, to avoid one fate above all: capture by the Soviet Red Army. The numbers alone tell a staggering story. From D-Day on June 6, 1944, to April 30, 1945, the day Hitler took his own life, more than 2.8 million German soldiers surrendered to the Western Allies. Of those, 1.5 million laid down their arms in April alone. During the first 2 weeks of that month, an average of 39,000 surrendered each day. In the final 16 days, that number rose to nearly 59,000 per day. These men surrendered while Hitler still lived, while Nazi command still operated, and while military law demanded that they fight to the death. They had weapons and fortifications, but no will left to face eastward, where the Red Army advanced like a relentless engine of revenge. To understand why so many Germans surrendered, one must understand what they feared. Every soldier on the Western Front in 1945 had heard the stories from the East. Whispered accounts, censored letters, the hollow stares of those who had survived Stalingrad. In February 1943, 91,000 men of the 6th Army had surrendered there. Only about 6,000 ever returned home. The rest died from starvation, disease, exposure, or forced labor in Soviet camps. They had heard of death marches that dragged captives hundreds of miles into the Russian interior without food or rest, where the weak were shot where they fell. They knew of the mining camps in Siberia and the labor battalions in the Urals, where over 1 million German prisoners died before 1956. Post-war studies confirmed their fears. The West German Maschke Commission later found that out of roughly 3.6 million Germans captured by the Soviets, nearly 1.94 million died in captivity, a death rate of more than 1 in 3. But beyond fear of death, there was a deeper terror: the knowledge of what German forces had done in the Soviet Union. Since June 22, 1941, when Operation Barbarossa began, German troops had waged what they called a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation. Nazi ideology branded Slavic peoples as subhuman, fit only for enslavement or extermination. German planners had drawn up schemes to starve 30 million Soviet civilians to make living space for Germans. The Wehrmacht deliberately starved 3.3 million of the 5.7 million Soviet POWs it captured, a death rate of 57%. In comparison, only about 3.5% of British and American POWs died in German hands. German soldiers also knew of the atrocities committed across Soviet territory: the mass executions of Jews, partisans, and civilians. 2 million of the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust were killed on Soviet soil. Entire villages were burned. Whole families executed under collective punishment. The blood of 26 million Soviet soldiers and civilians stained German hands. By 1945, every German soldier understood that if captured by the Red Army, he faced not just an enemy's wrath but vengeance for unimaginable crimes. The contrast with the Americans could not have been sharper. From their first encounters, German soldiers discovered that the Americans fought and treated prisoners in a way entirely different from Nazi propaganda. Under orders from Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower, U.S. forces followed the Geneva Convention strictly. Prisoners received food, medical care, and humane treatment. They weren't executed, tortured, or used for forced labor. This reputation spread quickly. German troops could see with their own eyes that those who surrendered to the Americans were alive, well-fed, and even receiving medical help in makeshift POW enclosures near the front. That simple visible truth and survival became more powerful than any rumor. Between April 14th and 18th, 1945, as 317,000 men in the Ruhr pocket surrendered en masse, many did so after making a clear calculation: move east and face Soviet retribution, or head west and live. Field Marshal Model had already dissolved Army Group B, allowing his men to choose. The vast majority walked west. This wasn't only an act of self-preservation, it was also a recognition that Germany's future now depended on the mercy of the West. By May 1945, many Germans understood that their only chance for national survival lay with the Americans and British, who might one day help rebuild Germany instead of destroying it completely. The flood of surrenders that spring didn't happen overnight. It had begun taking shape months earlier, as the Western Front closed in. After D-Day, Allied troops steadily tightened their grip. By September 1944, France was liberated. By December, despite the setback of the Battle of the Bulge, Allied soldiers stood on Germany's western border, and the end was inevitable. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Soviet war machine that had been gathering strength since Stalingrad moved relentlessly westward. Operation Bagration, launched on June 22, 1944, the third anniversary of Operation Barbarossa, completely destroyed Germany's Army Group Center. In just 9 weeks, the Germans suffered between 400,000 and 450,000 casualties, marking the largest single defeat in their military history. By January 1945, Soviet forces had crossed into East Prussia and stood less than 100 miles from Berlin. The German army found itself trapped between two massive Allied powers, exhausted of manpower, crippled by Allied bombing, and nearly out of fuel. But the most important difference wasn't military, it was psychological. These two advancing Allied armies offered two very different futures to any German who surrendered. And by early 1945, German leadership understood that distinction well enough to try to use it. After Hitler's suicide on April 30th, Admiral Karl Dönitz took control of what remained of the German state. He pursued what historians later called a strategy of partial capitulations. His goal, revealed in captured documents now stored in the U.S. National Archives, was to buy time, to move as many German troops as possible westward to surrender to the British or Americans, sparing them from Soviet or Yugoslav captivity. Starting with the surrender in Italy on April 29th, Dönitz tried to arrange separate surrenders in the west while continuing the fight in the east. On May 4th, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery accepted the surrender of German forces in the Netherlands, northwest Germany, and Denmark. 2 days later, General Alfred Jodl arrived at Allied headquarters in Reims and offered to surrender all forces facing the Western Allies, while continuing resistance against the Soviets. General Eisenhower rejected the plan outright. He warned that if Germany refused full surrender, he would close all Western lines and force every German soldier to capitulate to the Soviets instead. Faced with no choice, Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender at 2:41 a.m. on May 7, 1945, ending the war in Europe. The Soviets, suspicious that the West had tried to cut them out, demanded a second ceremony in Berlin on May 8, the one they recognize as the official surrender. The Battle of Halbe best illustrates the desperate lengths to which German soldiers would go to avoid Soviet capture. Between April 24th and May 1, 1945, roughly 200,000 men from the encircled German Ninth Army, along with tens of thousands of civilians, were trapped southeast of Berlin. Their commander, General Theodor Busse, ordered a breakout toward American lines near the Elbe River, fully aware that surrendering to the Soviets meant near certain death. What followed was a slaughter. Soviet tanks, artillery, and infantry pounded the trapped forces without mercy. The Germans fought not for victory, but for survival, clawing their way westward through Soviet lines. About 30,000 eventually reached the Americans, roughly 1/3 of those trapped. Estimates of the dead range between 24,000 and 60,000, including both soldiers and civilians. For comparison, in the Ruhr pocket, where Germans surrendered to the Americans, about 10,000 died, while 317,000 were taken prisoner. The difference made clear which side the Germans preferred to face. Post-war investigations confirmed those instincts. A German government commission led by historian Erich Maschke found that about 3 million Germans were taken prisoner by the Soviets. Of those, Nearly 1.94 million died in captivity between 1941 and 1955, a death rate of over 35%. For those captured by the Americans, the death rate was under 1%. The soldiers surrendering in the spring of 1945 didn't know those exact numbers, but they understood the truth behind them. Soviet captivity meant a strong chance of death, while American captivity meant a strong chance of survival. At first, even U.S. forces struggled to handle the sheer number of prisoners. The temporary Rheinwiesenlager, Rhine meadow camps, were open-air enclosures hastily built in April 1945 to contain hundreds of thousands of captured Germans. Resources were stretched thin, food and shelter were limited in the early weeks. Yet despite these hardships, conditions gradually improved as the Allied command worked to build permanent camps. By the summer of 1945, most prisoners had been transferred to proper facilities. According to the 1974 Maschke Commission, between 4,000 and 6,000 Germans died in American custody, roughly 1% of those held. Later claims of up to 1 million deaths promoted by author James Back were thoroughly debunked. Historians showed that his figures misinterpreted transfers and releases as deaths. The rapid collapse of organized German resistance in the West, compared to the suicidal fighting that continued in the East, showed how deeply this fear shaped behavior. Historian Rudiger Overmans estimated total German military deaths at 5.3 million. Of those, about 4 million, nearly 80%, occurred on the Eastern Front. The fighting there was ruthless, without mercy, and often to the death. In the Battle of Berlin alone, fought from April 16 to May 2, 1945, the Germans suffered between 92,000 and 100,000 killed, over 220,000 wounded, and 480,000 captured. The defense was fanatical, fought street by street, house by house, with Hitler Youth and Volkssturm militia standing beside regular army troops. Ammunition, food, and medicine ran out, yet the defenders kept fighting as Soviet artillery reduced the city to rubble. On the Western Front, the story was completely different. German units still had ammunition, fortifications, and the ability to resist, but they simply chose not to. The Ruhr Pocket illustrated this perfectly. From April 1st, when the Americans completed their encirclement, to April 18th, when the last resistance ended, German forces held every tactical advantage. The Ruhr was Germany's industrial heartland, dense, fortified, and well supplied. Army Group B had 370,000 men, 19 divisions, and strong defensive positions. They could have fought a brutal urban battle like Stalingrad. Instead, mass surrenders began on April 14th after Model dissolved his command. Entire divisions marched unarmed into American lines. The 116th Panzer Division, once a proud veteran unit that had fought from Normandy to the Ardennes, surrendered without a single working tank or gun left, but with its soldiers still capable of fighting. They simply chose not to. For them, surrendering to the Americans wasn't defeat, it was survival. Total American casualties in the reduction of the Ruhr Pocket were about 10,000, while German surrenders reached 317,000. The math of that exchange, fewer than 1 American casualty for every 30 Germans captured, shows that most Germans gave up without a fight. This same pattern spread across Western Germany throughout April 1945. As American forces pushed deeper into the country, they encountered what General Eisenhower described as a whipped army. Towns and cities surrendered with white flags, offering only token resistance or none at all. German troops often retreated a short distance only to surrender at their next encounter. The daily capture numbers tell the story clearly. In March 1945, Allied forces were taking about 10,000 prisoners each day. In the first 2 weeks of April, that number surged to 39,000 per day. During the final 16 days of April, it peaked at 59,000 per day. These weren't all combat captures. Many were voluntary surrenders from units that simply abandoned their defenses. Their reasoning was straightforward. If they fought the Americans, they might delay defeat by a few days, but risk being overrun by the Soviets soon after. If they retreated east, they'd fall into Soviet hands anyway. Surrendering to the Americans gave them their only real chance at survival, and possibly a future. By May 1945, many German soldiers understood that their country's survival depended on how the Western Allies, especially the United States, would handle post-war reconstruction. To surrender to the Americans was not just to save one's life, it was to choose which Germany one hoped to live in after the war. The question remains: why did German forces in the East continue fighting with such intensity, while the West collapsed almost peacefully? The answer lies in the vastly different consequences of defeat. On the Western Front, surrender often meant survival. A commander could give up his men to American captivity, knowing that they would likely live to see home again. On the Eastern Front, surrender meant probable death. The mortality rate in Soviet camps, around 1 in 3, made any surrender feel like a death sentence. Commanders who had led their men for years could not bring themselves to condemn them to that fate, without exhausting every last option. Another factor was humanitarian, at least in their own minds. In early 1945, millions of German civilians, mostly women, children, and the elderly, were fleeing westward ahead of the advancing Red Army. Refugee columns stretched for miles, using wagons, trains, and even on foot, carrying what little they could. German troops on the Eastern Front saw their continued resistance as a shield to buy time for these civilians to escape. This mix of military pragmatism, national loyalty, personal fear, and deep awareness of collective guilt shaped the decisions German soldiers made in 1945. Most weren't driven by moral repentance, though some surely felt it. They were making hard, calculated choices about survival. Their decision to surrender to the Americans instead of the Soviets reflected a rational understanding of the odds, an understanding formed by what they had done in the East, what they knew the Soviets would do in return, and what they had observed from American conduct. The final days of the war made this reality painfully clear. Even after Germany's unconditional surrender on May 7th and 8th, some units continued fighting briefly, desperate to reach American lines before the deadline took effect. In Latvia, the Courland Pocket, Army Group North, surrendered to Soviet forces on May 9th, a day after the official end of the war. In Czechoslovakia, German units fought Soviet troops while trying to break through to American positions. The Prague Uprising, which began on May 5th, turned into brutal street combat. German forces responded with violence, fearing that Czech partisans would hand them over to the Soviets. Only when American and Soviet troops met and clearly defined occupation zones did the last battles finally stop. For those who surrendered to American forces, captivity proved difficult but survivable. The early months in the Rheinwiesenlager, or Rhine meadow camps, were harsh, overcrowded and short on supplies, but conditions steadily improved as the Allies built permanent camps. Most German POWs held by the Western Allies were repatriated between 1945 and 1948. They returned to a devastated country, bombed-out cities, a shattered economy, and a divided nation. Yet they returned alive. They rebuilt, raised families, and became citizens of either West Germany or East Germany, depending on where they settled. Many who returned to the West became strong supporters of democracy and the transatlantic alliance. The experience was entirely different for those captured by the Soviets. The roughly 480,000 taken at Berlin, along with over 1 million others captured on the Eastern Front in the war's final months, were sent into a system built on forced labor. The Soviet Union, devastated by 26 million dead, 1,700 destroyed cities, and 32,000 ruined factories, needed manpower to rebuild. Officially, Moscow adhered to the Geneva Convention, but in practice, economic reconstruction came first. German POWs became a vital workforce, laboring in mines, factories, and construction sites across the USSR. Conditions were brutal during 1945 and 1946, as famine and shortages swept the Soviet Union. Prisoners barely survived on starvation rations. By 1947, as the Soviet economy recovered, their situation improved and repatriation began. Most returned home between 1947 and 1950, though the last German POWs did not come back until 1956, 11 years after the war ended. These surrender decisions shaped not just individual destinies, but the political landscape of post-war Europe. The choice of where to lay down arms determined not only who lived or died, but which Germany, democratic or communist, those men and their families would help rebuild. Nearly 3 million German soldiers who surrendered to the Western Allies became the backbone of West German society after the war. They returned home with first-hand experience of American military strength, organization, and the willingness to treat enemies according to international rules. Combined with the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Germany, and the American security guarantee against Soviet expansion, these experiences laid the foundation for West Germany's orientation toward the West and its later integration into NATO. Many post-war German leaders had themselves chosen American captivity over Soviet vengeance. Whether these millions of soldiers ever faced justice for their roles in Nazi crimes remains a complicated question. Most were never prosecuted. The war crimes trials targeted high-ranking officials, SS members, concentration camp staff, and those directly responsible for atrocities. Ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers, even those who fought on the Eastern Front or witnessed crimes, typically returned home without facing legal consequences. As a result, millions of men who had fought for a regime of aggression and genocide were reintegrated into post-war civilian life. The Soviet Union handled captured Germans differently, reflecting both its suffering and its priorities. Soviet authorities used German prisoner labor to rebuild what the German invasion had destroyed. Prisoners were held longer, forced to work harder, and released more slowly than those in Western hands. Germany's division into occupation zones, eventually becoming East and West Germany, meant that where a soldier surrendered in 1945 often decided which country he would live in after his release. Those captured by the Americans typically returned to West Germany. Those taken by the Soviets usually ended up in the East. Looking back, the mass German surrender of 1945 stands as one of history's most remarkable military collapses, not just for its scale, but for its selectivity. German forces didn't simply quit. They surrendered strategically. They chose their enemies carefully. They made rational decisions about survival. The 3 million who surrendered to the Western Allies effectively voted against continued Nazi resistance and against Soviet captivity. They chose survival over honor, the future over the past, and American pragmatism over Soviet revenge. The statistics of the war's end reflect this stark contrast. In the West, German prisoners vastly outnumbered those killed or wounded. In the East, the opposite was true. German deaths and injuries far exceeded captures. Every German soldier killed fighting the Red Army in 1945 was someone who might have lived had his unit been facing the Americans instead. Every Soviet soldier who died that year was fighting an enemy that elsewhere was surrendering in droves. For the Americans, the flood of German surrenders was both reassuring and unsettling. It validated their belief in discipline and fair treatment of prisoners, but it also exposed a moral complexity. U.S. commanders knew the Germans weren't surrendering out of respect or repentance. They were escaping Soviet retribution. Eisenhower and other Allied leaders had to balance cooperation with the Soviets against managing this overwhelming influx of prisoners. The consequences of these surrender choices shaped Europe's future. West Germany, filled with men who had surrendered to Western forces, became a democratic, prosperous U.S. ally. East Germany, populated partly by men who survived Soviet captivity, became a communist state under Moscow's control. Even after reunification in 1990, the psychological legacy of those wartime decisions persisted. Germany's strong ties to NATO and the United States were rooted partly in the choices millions of its soldiers made in 1945, to surrender westward and live. Ultimately, the story of why German soldiers surrendered in such massive numbers to the Western Allies is one of rational survival. The difference between East and West was simple but decisive. Surrendering to Americans meant about a 1% chance of dying in captivity. Falling into Soviet hands meant roughly a 1 in 3 chance of never returning home. Faced with that reality, millions walked west. The 480,000 German soldiers trapped in Berlin during the final battle had no such option. Surrounded by the Red Army, they fought to the end and faced the fate their comrades had been desperate to avoid. Those who surrendered to the Americans avoided final battles and instead stepped into a future where the U.S. would become an ally, rather than an enemy, a future where survival was possible and rebuilding could begin. They laid down their weapons, but in doing so, they saved their lives. In the brutal logic of war's end, they made the choice that any of 3 million men might make when faced with death. They walked toward the side most likely to let them live. That choice, available in the West but not in the East, explains why the Western Front collapsed while the Eastern Front bled to the very end. It explains why American forces captured millions with minimal losses, while Soviet troops fought for every mile at staggering cost. The mathematics of victory in Europe were written not only in strategy and firepower, but also in the difference between two forms of captivity, one that offered life and one that often led to death. Whatever their crimes or beliefs, German soldiers understood that difference. When given the chance, they chose to live, and that choice, multiplied millions of times in the spring of 1945, ended the war in the West sooner and shaped the post-war world for generations.